QuickBooks Desktop Pro 2021 Company Preferences, Bills, Calendar, and Checking. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars practice file homepage. We're going to be opening up the preferences now. So I'm going to go to the drop down in the edit drop down. We're going to be going down to the preferences, opening up the preferences. Last time we took a look at the accounting preferences. This time we're going to be looking at the bills, the calendar, and the checking. Let's start with the bills. So we're going to go to the bills. We have two tabs up top, as is often the case. My preferences has nothing in it. We have the company preferences for the bills. Bills are due 10 days after receipt. Now this is going to be your default. So when we enter the bills into the system, bills are going to be things just like they sound, right? They're going to be a bill, but typically you might say, hey, if I have a bill, I might pay it at the start, right when I get it, which means we will write a check for it at that point in time, or you might enter it as a bill, which would increase the accounts payable account, tracking the fact that you owe the bill, organize those bills, and then pay them at a future time. So this is going to be, in that case, it's going to be tracking the accounts payable, and so you could set the default to be some other amount. We're going to enter the bill and then pay it in some way in a future point in time. So warn about duplicate bill numbers from the same vendor. So that's going to be a useful thing typically to have from an audit trail perspective. So we're going to keep that default on. Automatic use of credits. We're not going to turn on the automatic use of credits. Automatic use of discounts. So if you have some type of automatic discount, then you could check that on and you can pick the appropriate account for it. We're going to keep the default as being off on that as well. Let's move on down to the calendar. So going on to the calendar, we have nothing under the company preferences, but if we go on over to the My Preferences, then we have the calendar preferences. Now the calendar, if you look at the home tab, is going to be over here. We have the calendar that you can then open up. The calendar is useful within QuickBooks. It might not be your primary calendar that you use, but the reason it's useful within QuickBooks is because you could set reminders that are necessary within QuickBooks. And so the calendar can be useful for that regard. So when you open up the calendar, we got the reminder on the last view. So daily view, weekly view, or monthly view. So, and the default is to remember the last view. So if you want to open it all the time at basically the monthly view, even if you left off on the daily view, then you can change the default here. So we have the weekly view versus the 5 days, 7 days that you can be checking off here. And then we can have show all transactions, or you can basically have some different filters in that regard. Upcoming and past due settings display, so we can display show, hide, show only if data exists. Then we have the upcoming date, show 7 days, show 60 days. Now, if we open up the calendar, I'm going to close this out just so you can get a look at the calendar. Opening up the calendar here. And obviously, once you start to use the calendar, then you might want to go back into those settings and check it out again. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. I do have the open windows open on the left-hand side, which is on the view drop-down. And then taking a look at the open windows list, we'll open this up. You got your calendar view up top. You got your months. You've got your different view settings that you can have. And then this is going to be the monthly view and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna close this back out. And then I'm going to go back into my preferences. So I'm going to go into the edit drop down. Let's go back into the preferences. So that's the calendar. Let's go into the checking. Checking is going to be a major kind of component that we're going to be needing to consider. So we have the default settings down below. Now, we don't have a checking account set up yet because we haven't set up a checking account. So we can't really go in and add these default items, but so we'll just kind of discuss them here. So we can open and write checks from which account. So the account that we would basically write from, we would typically have these all checked off. And when we select the drop-down account, we'll set up a checking account, our major checking account that will be then our major account that we will be selecting from. Open and pay bills. When we pay bills, we're going to pay them once again, most likely from our major checking account. And then we'll have this one will typically be checked off, and it'll say open and pay sales tax, again, once again, typically from our major checking account, unless we had some other system set up. Open and make deposits with our major checking account. Now, we don't have any checking accounts set up. We'll set those up when we get into the chart of accounts. So I'm going to uncheck these for now, but just note that most companies, if you have one checking account, your major checking account would have those checked off, and the primary checking account being the one that you will be using. Let's go to the company preferences, where we have the defaults set up here. These are basically the default settings. We have print account name on the vouchers. So if you want to put the account name on the vouchers, you can select that item. I'm going to keep the default as off. Change check date when non-cleared check is printed. Change check date when the non-cleared check is printed. I'm going to keep the default as off here. Start with payee field on the check. So when you start to, this is basically when you start to enter the data into the checks, if you're doing that a lot and you would rather it go directly to the payee field to make your data input a little bit faster, you can check that, but I'm going to keep the default here. Warn about duplicant check numbers. This is really useful because when you're writing checks, notice that there's a couple of ways you can do the checks in the QuickBooks system. You could actually just be entering checks as you go through. Note that many transactions these days might not be actual checks, right? Because many people are going to be using bank transfers and whatnot, electronic type of payments. So if you have electronic type of payments, you're not going to be having the same kind of thing with the check numbers. If you have check numbers, if you're writing actual checks, then you want to think about, well, usually you have to get those checks in some way, shape, or form from the bank. Now, if you're printing them out of the QuickBooks system, you still need to get the checks from the bank, and they will have a pre-printed check number on it, which will then be, you'll have to match up with the check number in the system. That's going to be an internal control. So you'll still have the checks from the bank that you'll have to put into the printer and print them from QuickBooks as you do the data input. Or you can actually just have a checkbook and write the checks. And whenever you write the checks, then you want to enter them into the QuickBooks system with the appropriate data, including the proper check number. So that means that you want to have the check numbers be different because that's going to be an internal control. The fact that the check numbers are on the checks is going to be an internal control against kind of fraud if you have a missing check number. So we typically want that there. Auto payee account number in check memo. So autofill the payee account number in the check memo. We're going to keep that as the default. We're going to select default account to use. Now, once again, we don't have a checking account set up right now. If we did, we probably would only have one major checking account, and we would be using that major checking account for most companies. So open and create checks. If we were to check that off, normally we would have one checking account. We would check it off and we would pick that checking account. If we had a checking account set up, that would typically be the default, but we don't have one set up yet. So then we have open the payroll liabilities. So when you pay payroll liabilities, once again, it would be coming out most likely of your major checking account unless you had a separate payroll account that you set up. But we're going to assume the major checking account. Now down here, you have the bank feed information. The bank feeds we're going to talk about more in a separate section after we go through the major kind of accounting. So because the bank feeds are something that can help you with the data input, but they can also be very confusing if you just upload a bunch of bank feeds because it's going to be a bunch of transactions that aren't fully assigned into the system. And if you don't know your accounting process, they can really kind of confuse things. But we will talk more about the bank feeds has a major improvement or a major change, which I believe is an improvement in the QuickBooks look and feel of the bank feeds. So I'm going to keep the default here in advanced mode. We'll talk more about bank feeds later. You can go to the express mode, however, which we have the create rules automatically. So this is where, and this could be useful for many people. You might want to turn on this mode because the bank rules will help you to QuickBooks to make automatic rules to help automate the process to record transactions. The problem with it is when QuickBooks makes the automatic rules, it's possible for them to make an incorrect automatic rule and then record all the transactions, from there forward incorrectly. So it can be really useful because it'll make things a little bit easier, but it can also cause problems. That's why in the advanced mode, it looks like they're going to here is saying, hey, if you want to set up a rule, we're going to force you to set up the rule yourself rather than us trying to predict, what's going to happen. So always ask before creating a rule. So that's another option you can say. You can say, don't every time you set up a rule, tell me at least that you're setting up a bank rule. So again, we'll talk more about that later. The classic mode is, I would assume, more the same mode from prior to 2021. 2021, you're going to have a new look and feel on the bank feeds. So if you want the old look and feel before the new changes, then looks like you could still use the classic mode. It looks to me like the new mode looks a lot better. So I would use that. So I would stick with the default here. Now, if you had made any changes, then I would then click the next item down below and it would say, do you want to save the changes? And then if you made changes, you said yes. Here, we didn't make any changes. We're just going to keep it as is.